Over the last couple of years, we've made several videos about different types of table saw blades, teeth counts, kerf size, including thin kerf blades. And we've also discussed the importance of splitters and riving knives to prevent binding and kickback. I'll link to some of those videos below if you want an education on that important subject. But today I want to address a common and I think sometimes confusing subject that often comes up in these discussions. Does the thickness of your splitter or your riving knife have to perfectly match the thickness of the saw blade you're using? For example, do you need a thin kerf splitter or riving knife to use a full kerf blade? And do you need a full kerf splitter or riving knife to use a thin kerf blade? If your saw doesn't allow for interchangeable splitters and riving knives, are you limited to using just a single blade thickness? A lot of folks debate these issues and nobody seems to agree on them. In fact, table saw manufacturers don't seem to agree either. One manual may say one thing, another manual may say the opposite, and most don't address the issue at all. Today, I'm going to speak to things I have learned over the years, but I want to be clear, this is kind of an open debate. It would take a great deal of controlled testing to confirm these things, and I haven't done that. So my advice to you is to just ask the manufacturer of your table saw what they recommend and follow that no matter what this video says. My opinions don't trump theirs. Now let's quickly discuss what I mean by kerf thickness to be sure everyone's on the same page. When you make a cut with a table saw blade, the path the blade follows through the wood is the kerf. That kerf is usually as wide as the blade's teeth. I say usually because a blade that's not properly aligned can plow a wider path than the thickness of the blade. But a blade can never cut a kerf that's narrower than the width of the teeth. And on every saw blade, the teeth are wider than the blade plate, or the body of the blade. This keeps the saw plate from binding in the cut and it reduces friction and heat. Most saw blade plates are about 2 millimeters thick, but the teeth, and therefore the kerf they cut through the wood, can vary widely in width. Often we classify blades as thin kerf and full kerf. Thin kerf blades are about 3/32 of an inch or 2.4 millimeters, and full kerf is about 1/8 of an inch or 3.2 millimeters. But thin kerf and full kerf are generic terms. As I said, the true thickness can vary from blade to blade. The purpose then of a splitter or a riving knife is to prevent wood from pressing against the side of the blade during the cut. If that was to occur, the wood could bind and then kick back towards you. Not only may you be struck and seriously injured by a flying piece of wood, but it can happen so quickly that your hand is pulled on top of the blade. This is how many table saw amputations occur. So riving knives and splitters are very important safety devices because they're designed so the wood will press or pinch against them instead of the spinning blade. For a splitter or a riving knife to work though, it must fit through the kerf that the blade cuts. If it's too wide for the kerf, the cut won't be possible. But what if the splitter or riving knife is narrower than the kerf? Does this mean it can no longer protect the blade from wood pinching against it? Well, it depends on how much narrower the splitter or riving knife is. There's some room for error. In fact, more than you might think. Consider this. Many table saws come with both splitters, which are attached to the blade guard, and riving knives that may be used to replace the blade guard. Riving knives don't stick up above the crown of the blade, so they're used for cuts that don't go all the way through the wood. It's only in those cases that you would use a riving knife instead of your splitter and blade guard. Some saw manufacturers offer a thin kerf riving knife and a full kerf riving knife. The idea is you can switch them back and forth when you change the thickness of your blade. By the way, if you're wondering why you would change the thickness of your blade, check out the link below for our thin kerf blade video. Having a full kerf and a thin kerf riving knife makes a lot of sense, right? The problem is most of your cuts aren't made with a riving knife. They are, or at least they should be, made with your blade guard in place, which has the splitter. Surely the saw manufacturer will tell you to make your cuts with the blade guard. But the manufacturer doesn't usually offer two different blade guards, so the splitter can't be swapped from thin to full kerf. The splitter is often one size fits all. My saw stop blade guard has a splitter with instructions etched on the side, and it says that it's 2 millimeters thick, which is less than 3/32 of an inch, and it's compatible with blades that create a kerf between 2.35 and 3.5 millimeters. Now that comes out to a little bit narrower than 3/32 and a little bit wider than 1/8. That is the full range of common saw blades, both thin and full kerf. So while they may offer thin and full kerf riving knives, they're essentially saying that the splitter on the blade guard, which you should use for most cuts, is fine even though it's thin. You can use it with full kerf blades. So how can that be? If the splitter is thinner than the blade's teeth, how can it keep the wood from binding against those teeth and creating kickback? Well, you have to understand how kickback works. I'm not going to go into it fully because we have a whole video about it. I'll link to that below. But the most common cause of kickback is a kerf closing during the cut, pinching on the back of the blade, or a board turning away from the fence into the blade. In both these cases, the teeth on the back of the blade can lift the board up off the saw and eject it towards you. Or the flat saw plate, the body of the blade, can bind against the wood through friction and then throw it back towards you. That second reaction, the wood binding against the saw plate, that's primarily what a splitter or riving knife is going to prevent. To do that, the splitter must be thicker than the saw plate, and they always are. This one, as I said, is 2.3 millimeters thick, and it says it may be used with saw blade plates no thicker than 2.1 millimeters. So clearly, it's very important to them that the splitter or riving knife be slightly thicker than the saw body or plate. But as we discussed, there's room for error when it comes to the teeth thickness. This is because the riving knife or splitter doesn't have to completely protect the teeth from the wood. Teeth cut wood. They can take a little pressure. If the wood turns or pinches against the teeth on the back of the blade, the teeth can remove more wood and make the kerf a little wider. This is actually occurring during every cut. The teeth on the front of the blade are doing most of the cutting, but the sides of those back teeth, they're doing some cutting too, because your blade is probably not perfectly aligned to the fence, not to the thousandth of an inch. And even if it were, heat causes blade distortion, and that could change the alignment of the blade and how the teeth cut. So those back teeth are always coming into contact with the wood. You can't fully prevent it. The goal is to do most of the cutting with the front teeth, which are spinning down towards the top of the saw, and only allow the back teeth to barely brush against the wood because they're moving upward and they may lift the workpiece if they get a big bite. That's what a riving knife or a splitter does. It keeps the wood from binding against the saw plate, which can't cut, and it limits how much of a bite the back teeth can get. It doesn't totally prevent contact with those back teeth. It just limits that contact to what's safe. Blade alignment, distortion, and the wide range of blade thicknesses make it impossible to size your riving knife or your splitter to the full thickness of the teeth or the kerf they cut and totally prevent those back teeth from rubbing against the wood. So the bottom line, in my opinion, is your splitter or riving knife should be slightly wider than the saw plate, which virtually all of them are, and you shouldn't worry about matching it fully to the kerf. I use just one splitter and one riving knife on my table saw, regardless of whether I use a full kerf or a thin kerf blade. I don't worry about that slight difference. Of course, some saw manufacturers may add that blade guards often include anti-kickback pawls, so they might have different recommendations for the riving knife, which doesn't benefit from features like that. So if they say otherwise, follow their advice. I'll see you next time. If you get what you pay for, then why are bandsaw blades so inexpensive at sawblade.com? Seriously, they're as good as any I've used. They come in any size you need, and they cost quite a bit less than anything comparable at the woodworking retailers. Try them for yourself at the link below this video. You'll see. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.